Recommendations for carbohydrate intake during exercise have come a long way since the one-size-fits-all approach of the late 1990s. In this video, I will review what the latest recommendations are for carbohydrate intake during training and racing events in order to optimize performance and recovery. So before we get into the research, let's cut right to the chase. For events lasting less than 45 minutes, exogenous intake does not appear to improve performance, although ingesting a gel right before the start of a short but intense race couldn't hurt. For events lasting 45 to 75 minutes, current evidence supports consumption of a small amount of carbohydrate such as typically found in sports drinks. This is especially important for athletes who don't eat breakfast prior to an event when liver glycogen levels are decreased. Here again, I would probably ingest a gel right before the start of a race and consume a carbohydrate sports drink during the event. For events lasting 1 to 2 to 2.5 hours, intakes of exogenous carbohydrates in the range of 30 to 60 grams per hour have proven to be tolerable and beneficial to performance. Most forms of carbohydrate will work. For events lasting 2 to 2.5 hours or longer, well, here is where we see that higher amounts in the range of 60 to 90 grams per hour have been shown to benefit performance. So how exactly did they come up with this number? An important series of studies tracking oxidation rates of various forms and combinations of carbohydrates found that the rate-limiting step was absorption from the intestines into the bloodstream. Glucose is absorbed by a sodium-dependent transporter called CGLT1. The highest rate of absorption for this transporter was around 1 gram per minute or 60 grams per hour. It was initially believed that this was the highest amount of exogenous carbohydrate that could be ingested and absorbed. However, when glucose is consumed with a carbohydrate that is absorbed by a different transporter such as fructose, which uses a GLUT5 transporter, rates of ingested carbohydrate can exceed 1.5 grams per minute or 90 grams per hour. Thus, when glucose and fructose are ingested at a 2-to-1 ratio, absorption is improved and oxidation is increased. But are there performance benefits to ingesting this much carbohydrate? One large-scale study on cyclists and triathletes had the athletes ride for 2 hours at a moderate to high intensity. During the ride, a range of carbohydrate levels, 10 to 120 grams per hour, were ingested. Following the 2-hour ride, subjects completed a 20-kilometer time trial. The greatest performance enhancement was seen at ingestion rates between 60 and 80 grams per hour, which is in line with the above recommendation. Performance improvements have also been demonstrated when the same dose of carbohydrate was ingested in a mixed form versus glucose only. In this study, trained male cyclists ingested either a water placebo, a glucose-only beverage, or a glucose plus fructose drink at a rate of 1.8 grams per minute or 108 grams per hour. They used a 2-to-1 glucose to fructose ratio. Following the 2-hour submaximal ride, they performed a time trial. Those consuming the mixed drink of fructose and glucose had faster times during the time trial compared to the glucose-only condition, and a 19% faster finish compared with the water-only condition. Reductions in perception of fatigue were also noted when both glucose and fructose were ingested. Now, most fluids, gels, bars offered by sports nutrition companies use a mix of multiple transportable carbohydrates. Incidentally, mixtures of carbohydrates in solid form, such as from a bar, have been shown to be equally as effective compared to other forms of carbohydrate. Finally, rates are also similar between men and women. Sugar or carbohydrate-rich foods such as dates, raisins, potatoes, and bananas are also good sources of mixed transportable carbohydrates and have been shown to work as well as more processed sources. But what about different body sizes? I used to think that because I was smaller and lighter that I didn't have to consume as much as my taller and heavier husband. However, there is good evidence that there is little difference in the oxidation rates of exogenous carbohydrate based on body size. Factors such as the carbohydrate content of one's diet or habitual intake during training sessions play a bigger role in determining one's capacity for oxidizing ingested carbohydrate during exercise. This is also why the recommendations are given in absolute amounts rather than relative to body weight. But what about even higher amounts? A recent study by Veribe, a nutrition advisor to the Astana Pro Cycling team, has turned the above recommendations slightly on their head. He had observed that those cyclists who were able to ingest the most carbohydrate during training and racing seemed to recover better. So he decided to put this observation to the test. So he and his group compared carbohydrate intake in 3 groups of elite runners doing a challenging mountain marathon race. It was challenging in that it had a lot of vertical gain and loss. They had one group consume 60 grams per hour of carbohydrate, which is typical of what most athletes do. Another group did 90 grams per hour, which is what is recommended. And a third group ingested a whopping 120 grams per hour. Okay, that is almost 500 calories an hour. Now, what was unique about this study was that in the 4 weeks prior to the race, they had the athletes train 2 days a week with 120 grams per hour during long training runs. Dietary carbohydrate intakes were also high prior to the race and was the same for all groups, and they also used that 2-to-1 glucose to fructose ratio. Now, ultra-running events and mountain marathons such as this tend to result in extremely high levels of muscle damage. For example, markers of muscle damage such as creatine kinase was found to increase by as much as 1,447% following a 67-kilometer mountain ultramarathon, and these levels can peak as much as 72 hours post-race. Other markers of muscle damage such as lactate dehydrogenase, or LDH, and glutamic oxaloacetic transaminase, or GOT, also increase substantially. What this study on these mountain runners found was that these markers were significantly lower in those consuming the highest amounts of carbohydrate, 120 grams per hour, compared to the medium and low groups. Thus, there was a lower level of exercise-induced muscle damage in the group that was able to consume the most carbohydrate during the race. Moreover, the authors also tested the runners 24 hours after the race to assess neuromuscular function and high-intensity run capacity. Those consuming the high carbohydrate load during the race performed better on these tests compared to the 90 and 60 gram per hour groups, demonstrating that higher carbohydrate intakes during an event such as this improves recovery and mitigates the decrease in performance capacity post-race. Measures of internal load during the race, as assessed by RPE by duration and TRIMP or training impulse for the marathon, were also lower for the highest carbohydrate intake group. While race times weren't statistically significantly different between the groups, the trend was for the high carbohydrate intake group to do better, i.e. the high carbohydrate group finished in 4 hours and 31 minutes, whereas the low carb group in 4 hours and 38 minutes. Have other studies shown similar results? Well, hardly any, and we certainly need to do more research to corroborate these findings. A previous study did find that during Ironman races, higher carbohydrate intakes, up to 136 grams per hour in some athletes, were correlated to faster race times. But they didn't look at post-race measures of muscle damage or recovery. The gut is trainable, and when trained, even higher carbohydrate intakes can be achieved than originally thought. Animal studies have shown that there is upregulation of intestinal carbohydrate transporters when the animals were exposed to a high carbohydrate diet. The reverse was also true in that there was a downregulation of SGLT1 and reduced glucose uptake capacity when exposed to a chronic low carbohydrate diet. Another study by Cox et al. Looked at altering daily carbohydrate intake and its effects on carbohydrate oxidation. They found that carbohydrate oxidation rates were higher after a high-carb diet compared to a control lower carbohydrate diet. Thus, it seems prudent to practice carbohydrate intake both during training as well as have adequate carbohydrate intake in the daily diet. So in conclusion, first, while intakes above 90 grams per hour during longer events may or may not improve performance, it does appear to mitigate muscle damage and speed up recovery. Thus, ingesting up to 120 grams of carbohydrate per hour is likely more helpful during multi-day events or weeks of high training loads where recovery is key. Secondly, don't try ingesting large amounts of carbohydrate during a race before first trying it in training. Okay, I think you already know that. If your current training intakes of carbohydrate are low, gradually work up to higher amounts and see how much you can tolerate. You also don't need to ingest large amounts of carbohydrate during every workout. Rather focus on 1 or 2 longer workouts a week where you really try to consume a lot of carbohydrate during those workouts. Thirdly, consume a high carbohydrate diet, as this can help to upregulate glucose and fructose transporters and help with training the gut. Thanks so much for watching. In the next video, I will continue with this theme and also address the question as to whether training with low carbohydrate availability is beneficial.